Last week I spoke to Rob Hersov, and he had some pretty controversial things to say about what South Africa should be doing with its oil and gas reserves. In other words, he said, forget about the international community, forget about the greenies, tell them to stuff off, let's go big in the Karoo. Well, it's a bit more complicated than that, and we'll hear in just a moment from Derek Light, who has been following and been involved in this saga for the last 14 years. Mr. Light, really good to have you on our BizNews platforms this morning, particularly because of the insights that you have in the whole Karoo fracking. I know Rob Hersov calls it gas to power, but let's just stick with fracking because that's the word most people know. And your involvement goes back to 2009, when you were commissioned by a landowner to represent them on the proposed fracking of the Karoo by Shell. So we are going back a long, long time. What exactly was their concern then, and what have you been up to in those past 14 years?
Alec, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity. When we got involved initially in January of 2009, it was to attend a public participation meeting convened by Bundu Gas and Oil that had applied for shale gas exploration rights in the Karoo, and particularly south of Graaff-Reinet towards Pearson. Our concerns at that time were what impact the process might have on the environment, and in particular also on agriculture. Water was a concern. At that time, you must know that we were very uninformed. We knew that there was methane gas trapped in shale rock, but we were unfamiliar with the process that would make that accessible or exploitable. And the oil and gas companies didn't disclose the method they would be using. And we, with very limited resources and some assistance from the geology department at Rhodes and at Nelson Mandela University, raised our concerns, the lack of information and the lack of disclosure of technical information. And we successfully warded off the initial application by Bundu, which was renewed and then disclosed that hydraulic fracturing would be used, but again giving limited information. So we had to upskill ourselves and learn about the process, and we were compelled to draw on the USA experience and experts in that country to inform us on the process. So we quickly realized that there was a lack of transparency. There was a lack of knowledge on the process. There was a lack of knowledge on understanding the groundwater reserves of the Karoo and the geology of the Karoo and the risks associated with that. And it was clearly apparent that there was a lack of adequate legislation. And we then raised those concerns in the second process.
This is interesting stuff, Mr. Light. Let's just go back to that in a moment. Just to also set the scene a little more, you are an attorney based in Graaff-Reinet. So this is your background, your backyard rather, where all of this is intended to occur.
I've been a resident of the Karoo for most of my life. I've practiced in Graaff-Reinet since about 94. And my client base is largely people from the Karoo. I'm a country lawyer, to put it that way. And we quickly had to...
I'd like us just to have a look at what's at stake here. So if you can just bear with me, I'm going to bring up a picture which kind of got everything going in the first place. And I remember back in 2009, I also saw this. And you can see this is from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. It's a very interesting picture because it shows the shale gas reserves around the world. And there you've got one in South Africa, which is pretty much the Karoo, but it seems to go a lot further. But what also got people very excited about all of this was the next table, which I took from the U.S. Energy Information Administration's website today, in fact. And as you can see there, this organization says that South Africa has got the 8th highest shale gas resources in the world. There are 390 trillion cubic feet, more than half of the United States. And we know that shale in the United States, or fracking in the United States, has transformed their energy equation. So I just wanted to bring those up so that people know what's at stake and they know what actually is going on here, i.e. lots and lots and lots of money potentially, if all of this information is correct, which is now being spread worldwide.
Well, Alec, it's actually that's part of the problem, and that's part of the incorrect point of departure that your previous guest followed. That information is not correct. It's totally overestimated. The reserves are totally overestimated. We don't have 392 trillion cubic feet of shale gas in this country. In fact, there may be none. The study conducted by the CSIR, and I can read it to you as a heading, and one of the chapters simply says this: the total quantity of shale gas that occurs within the study area, that's the Karoo Basin, is uncertain as where exactly it may be concentrated. Firstly, where is this gas? And there may be no economically viable extractable gas. And it's a problem because the oil and gas companies use those figures to promote their position when they approach the public and in the public participation process, because it advances their position, because they create expectation in our communities of substantial job opportunities, massive economic benefits to this country and to communities. And it's misleading because it's not yet established, and the available evidence indicates that there is going to be substantially less gas, and on the scientific information currently available, there may be nothing, and the reserves might prove to not be viably extractable. So it's misleading to say to the public that we are going to create this wonderful opportunity for you. Beaufort West is going to thrive. It's going to become a boom town. Nonsense. It may not happen at all. Various institutions in this country have been conducting research, much at our instance, because when we raised these concerns that I alluded to earlier, one of them was, are there viable reserves of shale gas? Are they viably extractable? And the answer is we don't know. And when we raised these concerns, government saw that, and they imposed a moratorium on new applications. At the time that happened, Shell BV had come on board. They had applied for exploration rights in 3 discrete regions, totaling some 90,000 square kilometers. And an Irish-based company, Falcon, had also applied for rights. So that process was put on hold, and no further applications would be entertained, because government realized that they needed to inform themselves better on this process and the potential benefit and cost to this country. So they appointed a task team to report to government on the state of knowledge on all of these aspects. And there are various aspects that needed to be considered. And the report came back.
Before we go on to that report, because it's quite important, I don't want to run through the key issues here. We have a US agency which is propagating this information. So where did they get their information from? And that's the first point. And the second point, which I'd love you to answer just from a personal perspective, because when I saw these figures, it was told to me that Sukor, in the old apartheid government, we know they were desperately looking for oil everywhere, and that they put they pockmarked the Karoo with their drills, but they never found any oil. But apparently, as I was told, they found a lot of gas. So where does all of this come from? It's almost like what you're telling us is, hang on, this is a myth. This is actually not true. But how was the myth established?
It's not true. It's established by the industry, the myth. Alec, the core drilling samples that Sukor took are still available to scientists and geologists to procure data. We have the well reports of Sukor exploration, And their biggest find was in Pierston, a place called Crane Mere. And we've studied that well report and the findings of very eminent geologists at the time. And you must realize that South Africa was embargoed at that time. So it was essential that they find sources of energy and not walk away from them if they exist. And they did find gas. There is methane gas in the Karoo, okay? It occurs in different forms and at different levels and in different structures. When you drill a hole of 3,000 meters, you're likely to encounter methane gas in little pockets, and you are unlikely on the available evidence to find it in the shale, and I'll get back to that. But methane gas was found by Suko, but it depleted almost immediately. In other words, the reserves were not viable. They were recorded, but they were not viable. And those boreholes are still there. And in fact, Bundu Gas and Oil and others have wanted to get access to the Cranmere borehole to do further testing and so on. I must just say this, though, that the hydraulic fracturing as we know it today, a very advanced technique, did not exist at that time. There was fracturing done to increase the longevity of oil wells in the United States. That's how the process started. And it's now been refined. But if you look at the information we now have on the geological structures, and I must again caution, and I want to get back to that, is there's a huge lack of knowledge on the underground structures in the Karoo relating to geological structures and to water. And that research has to be done and is being done as we speak. But we called for that because you cannot make decisions on these issues until you are properly informed. And it now appears that, look, millions of years ago in the Karoo, and this is what distinguishes the Karoo from the Marcellus Shale and other shale formations in the United States. We've got a peculiar geology. And there was millions of years ago, hundreds of millions of years ago, there were what they call geological upheavals. Specifically, there was an intrusion of hot lava, dolerite. We've got dolerite structures in the Karoo which don't appear in those other areas where shale gas has been targeted in the States. That process is believed to have reduced the volume of gas that originally was available in the Karoo. And this has now been borne out by recent, you must understand that flowing from this, government, through the Minister of Environmental Affairs, had a strategic environmental assessment done by 146 eminent scientists that was peer-reviewed by international and independent scientists, so that the collective knowledge of 200 scientists under the able leadership of Professor Bob Scholes of WITS conducted a study into all of the areas impacted on by the proposed shale gas development, and environmental impact and economic benefits and so on. And flowing from that, the University of Johannesburg, Nelson Mandela University in Port Elizabeth, the University of the Free State, PASA, the Council for Geosciences, other departments have been doing research to try and augment the state of knowledge because, as we pointed out, the lack of knowledge militates against decision-making. And one of the key unknowns is what the volumes of gas are and where they are. Now, your previous guest was terribly excited about Beaufort West. Now, these scientists have said...
No, but Mr. Light, sorry, he was excited about Beaufort West because the mayor of Beaufort West, who's a politician, said it could become another Kimberley of the 1800s or a Johannesburg of the gold rush. That's how he's seeing it, based on these American numbers, which we still haven't discussed. Where did they get it from? Where did the EIA get it from?
I actually can't answer that question off the cuff. I can look into that for you, but they are wrong. The science, the available science, shows that they are wrong. Okay, at best, recent data suggests 13 TCF at best. There might be none. The drilling and testing done.
That's a long way from 390.
But isn't it just? Yeah. It's massively different because it makes a nonsense of the econometrics report by the late Tony Twine. It makes a nonsense of your previous guest's articles. He wrote an article which you published on the 3rd of January.
His name's Rob Hersov.
Rob Hersov.
Yeah, Mr. Light. It's Rob Hersov.
I don't know the gentleman.
Are you so adorned with him you don't want to mention his name?
Well, I think he's a little arrogant, And if you're going to make sweeping statements that are going to that thousands of people read and are motivated by, what you do is you psych up a community and the country with prospects that are not going to be realized, and it's irresponsible. One must approach these things objectively and inform yourself fully before you make public statements. And we did the same. And we said to government, you must do the same. And that is being done. And the results from the University of Johannesburg suggest that these gas formations are over mature. There is no available gas. It's migrated or dissipated. Now, getting back to Beaufort West, because this is why I raised it, is there is some postulation amongst geologists, very clever people. They don't know where the gas is the general sort of remark in the SEA. But there are hydrogeologists or geohydrologists that venture and postulate that there might be sweet spots somewhere between the Dolorite Sills and the Cape Fold Mountains. Where exactly they don't know, but some of them suggest, and I think the Council of Geosciences are looking at that, is that there might be a sweet spot between Beaufort West and Murraysburg somewhere. I'm speaking in general terms because there are diagrams and things to illustrate this. But Professor de Wit's team from Nelson Mandela suggests that the sweet spots might be near Cradock. They're hundreds of kilometers apart, these places. So there's a lot of, I suppose, educated guesses being done, but the research will show, and I'm going to stick my neck out and say to you that I don't believe there's any viable gas reserve.
Mr. Light, just two questions to close off with, because you've made the argument very, very comprehensively. One of the things that Rob Hersov said was that Johan Rupert, who's South Africa's he's a global businessman, he's our preeminent businessman, that he's also, Graaff-Reinet is synonymous with the Rupert family. He's also, initially, I thought anyway, he was opposed to fracking, and Rob Hersov said, no, well, he didn't think that was the case anymore. Do you have any insight on that? Has he thrown his weight behind Mr. Hersov's ideas?
No, absolutely not. Is in fact, Rob Hersov's assertions were actually offensive to many of us, including Mr. Rupert. Mr. Rupert has roots in Graaff-Reinet, but he's also a very successful business person. He's not given to emotional stuff, as alluded to. We were sort of put in a camp by Mr. Hersov as being these greenies. That's not Mr. Rupert. What Mr. Rupert is a conservationist. And he, at an early stage in January 2011, when Shell BV's application became public, because they were the biggest company in the world at that time, and a very recognizable, most recognized brand in the world, it became a big deal. And Mr. Rupert then committed to our process as a landowner. And he has subsequently stuck with us until now and feels the same way. We don't believe that the Karoo has the reserves, and we don't, and the impact on the Karoo will be substantial. I just want to point out a few issues to you. For example, Hersov says, firstly, relying on that incorrect extent of the reserves that are available, that there will be 700,000 jobs. He says, he's in the article, and in his interview with you, he said there would be millions of jobs. The SEA, with a group of very eminent scientists and economists, suggested that figure, if there is a viable gas reserves of 5 or 20 TCF will be less than 3,000 jobs. Rob Hersov says it will add 200 billion rand per year to our economy. The SEA suggests that that will be somewhere between 14 to 28 billion. There's a massive factual. Hersov is factually incorrect.
Your piece on BizNews articulates this very well. Just to close off with, what is the state of play right now? There was a moratorium that was imposed, which you've explained. So where are we today as far as the state, as this issue?
The initial moratorium was extended and it still stands, okay? But it's limited to a geographical area, which is the southern Karoo Basin, sadly for people in KwaZulu-Natal and the Free State and so on, where coal bed methane will also be targeted with fracking ultimately. So the moratorium sadly does not apply to the whole country, but for the fact that the Supreme Court of Appeal has said you will not frack until it's properly regulated. So the state of play at the moment is that government's got to get its house in order as far as the legislation is concerned, and do so lawfully. The Minister of Environmental Affairs and Minister of Water Affairs have this last year published draft regulations to regulate fracking. There's been a public participation process. We've filed commentary also on financial provisioning. Those ministers must now present bills to Parliament, to have the legislation passed. If that legislation is inadequate or unlawful in any way, we will take that on review to the High Court, but that process is being followed. Simultaneously, research is being conducted, flowing from these various reports and the work being done by the Association of South African Scientists. So, to augment knowledge. So, the process is in limbo, and that's why Hersov's suggestion that these things, could turn around and produce gas for this country and energy within 24 to 36 months is just absolutely ludicrous. It shows a total misunderstanding of the process and the legal process and the various other processes that must be followed. I want to touch on the boomtown aspect because it causes hype and is misleading. The experience in the United States is this. A shale gas well has a lifespan of somewhere between 3 to 5 to 7 years. Then it's depleted. The worm that is the drilling has to then move on. And what the United States experience shows in states like Pennsylvania is that what happens is these little towns like us experience this massive boom because you've got this migration of people, you've got oil companies coming in, and they have a boom economy. 5 years later, that fails, and you have what we call a boom to bust economy, and you have ghost towns arising with all sorts of socioeconomic problems that arise from migration of workers and so on. Because people come to Beaufort West thinking they're going to get jobs, and there's a massive migration. The infrastructure of the towns can't handle it. They have massive socioeconomic problems, and then the worm moves on. And that happened in the States. And the other thing is that shale gas exploitation is actually not sustainable because it's a very limited resource, and you've got to move on. And what happened in the States was the success of fracking was more in the oil industry than it was in the gas industry. Chesapeake was the biggest drilling company in the world. In fact, they were identified as a company that might come and drill here for the oil companies that get the rights. They are bankrupt. They've been liquidated. Why? Because the cost of hydraulic fracturing is huge. And if you have a drop in the oil and gas prices like happened, because of the glut of oil and gas supplied, if it drops below $90 a barrel, we were told way back in when we were doing our investigation, it's not viable. And you know what the oil and gas prices did in recent years. They dropped as low as $28 a barrel, $40 a barrel. I don't know when last it was over $100 a barrel. You might know. I don't. You must be careful of the boom situation. There's a boom-bust situation.
Thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you also for articulating your arguments so forcefully in the article, which is on BizNews. And I've no doubt we will be returning to this discussion in the future, but it's lovely to have a real expert on the ground who's been with it, who's lived with it for 14 years in such a complex matter, and for shedding light on what could just be a myth, as you've explained to us now. Derek Light is an attorney in Graaff-Reinet. I'm Alec Hogg from BizNews.com.
Thank you, Alec.